of the 5th Annual International Conference on Popular Culture. I hope all of you had a hearty lunch, and we are about to begin the second plenary lecture. Will be delivered by Dr. Pinaki De. We are going to take 2 to 3 minutes because Dr. Pinaki De is going to come within 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll start our session. So we'll now directly move on to our second plenary lecture titled Comic as an Object, the Art, the Curious Case of Louvre as Space in Comics. But before that, we'd like to felicitate Dr. Pinaki De. And for felicitation, I would like to call upon stage our dear Professor, Dr. Probal Rai Chaudhary sir. Can we have a round of applause for that?
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you. Oh, thank you. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, Pravalda. Just take this.
Thank you, sir. So before we begin this plenary session, lecture, I would I would like to introduce Sir briefly. So, Pinaki De is a multiple award-winning graphic illustrator designer who regularly works for renowned publishers like Penguin Random House, HarperCollins, Hachette, Routledge, Primus, Oxford University Press, Singapore University Press, Bloomsbury, Orient Black Swan, Wordview, Pan Picarder, Permanent Black, Sage, Rowley, Sahitya Akademi, Rupa, and many others. He has designed almost 600 book covers to date. He is the winner of the Publishing Next Prize for the Best Book Cover Design in India, twice in 2017 and 2019. His book cover for Calcutta by Kunal Basu won the prestigious Oxford Bookstore Prize for the Best Cover Design in India at Jaipur Literary Fest in 2017. His layout design for Satyajit Ray's archival manuscripts has drawn applause from across the globe. A Charles Wallace Trust Fellow, his PhD is in comics theory. Mr. Pinaki is one of the editors of the prestigious annual magazine Longform, which is generally regarded as the first global comics magazine from India. He's the Indian Comics Advisor of Mangasia, the biggest ever exhibition on Asian comics, curated by Paul Gravett for the Barbican, London. His book-length comics On the Partition is due next year. Pinaki juggles his creative work with academics as he has a day job as an associate professor of Raja Pyare Mohan College, Uttarpada. With that, we welcome you, sir.
Thank you.
I request our HOD madam to please come and chair this session.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, okay, sir.
Main PPT. Okay, as they prepared the PPT, unfortunately, I cannot stand, at a place for a long time. So I've just taken the lapel because I'll be just trying to, roam about and talk. So today, I'm going to talk about something that is not discussed too much in comics. You can tell it's like the elephant in the room, but we don't talk about it too much. So comics as object the art, and I've taken a very interesting case study. And the case study is of Louvre Museum and comics on Louvre Museum. So you'll be very surprised to know that Louvre, the vanguard of classicism, classical art, has actually tied up with a French publisher, Futuropolis, to bring out 31 books. Okay? Okay. Okay. Wonderful. So, it has actually tied up with a publisher called Futuropolis to bring out 31 books on the museum, and they are all comics books. Now, this is very surprising. So, whenever we have a commemorative volume on museums, what we don't have comics artists doing art, right? We will probably have a coffee table book and everything. But look at Louvre. And they haven't done those comics on Louvre itself. They have reimagined Louvre as a space. So Louvre may be a setting in a science fiction world. Louvre can be a setting in a very different era. And yet somewhere the comics are all connected to the idea of Louvre as a space. So before I begin that, I want to question certain things which may be a bit controversial here. So let me begin first of all. What's happening? Which one? Oh, okay. Where? Nothing is happening. You just change the thing. Okay. So the first thing I'm sorry for this technical glitches, it happens, and when you are, reading about comics, there is no point in just, talking without the images. Just pass on the second one. Okay. So the first question that I want to ask, and it's a very simple question, but it's a question that is still unanswered. Is comics art? Now, what is art, of course? Anything can be art, right? But is comics art? Now, look at the origin of comics, right? And if you look at the origin of comics, the way it's sort of disseminated in the physical, world through, small underground, small stuff and all that, the word art and comics were almost far apart. And frankly, comics was not, was unapologetic about it. They didn't want the tag art to be associated with comics. It is only later that the publishers wanted to create a niche, and they brought this kind of term like graphic novels and all, And suddenly the world changed. Comics became part of studies, it became PhD theses, and today everybody is doing comics. But I want to ask a simple question: are we reading enough? We are not reading, we are not consumers of comics, we are just trying to produce academic materials out of comics, and it doesn't mean anything. It's like writing about films without looking at films in the way I love films. So the first thing is that question, is comics art? So next slide. I can go back to one of my favorite comic strip, and that is, of course, Calvin and Hobbes. We all love Calvin and Hobbes. And this is actually a comic strip which was published in 93. And then you can actually, I will read this out and you will find it very interesting. Look at the way a painting, so both of them are in a museum, right? And they're looking at a painting, moving, spiritually enriching, sublime, and the word high art, of course, is associated with painting. Exactly the next, panel is the comic strip, vapid, juvenile, commercial, hackwork, low art. So it's like a binary, right? The word high art, low art, it's like binaries. And, that's the way it was viewed during that time. A painting of a comic strip panel, sophisticated irony, philosophically challenging high art. Suppose I draw a cartoon of a painting of a comic strip. Sophomoric, intellectually sterile, low art. So, you can understand the irony here, but I love the way this topic is brought out in a comics. It's almost deconstructed it, right? So, is comics art? Let us go to the next. Can you go to the next thing? Let us go to the next kind. So, Tim Flaherty has a very interesting comment to make. And I just want all of you to, look at this very carefully, because all of you here are mostly academics working on comics. I want comic readers to work as academics. Oh, sorry. So the whole thing is, this is Stan Lee. And Stan Lee is the creator of what? Phantom, right? And Stan Lee has a wonderful, it's an interview with Stan Lee. And Tim Flaherty is actually quoting Stan Lee. When asked if he feels that it's strange that students write academic studies of comic books, Lee says, I used to think, what the hell are they so interested in comics for? These are comic strips. I've come to realize over the last few years that I was wrong. And these people who are interested in comics are right. So there is something happening which has suddenly elevated comics to that zone of high art. So comics are now part of exhibitions. Centre de Pompidou last year had one of the biggest exhibition in France, and it was on comic strips. Louvre has actually embraced comics in a big way. The ninth art, as it is called in France. So Louvre is actually having exhibitions of comic strips in the museum itself. And it has opened new areas for comics. Can we go to the next slide? Now, I actually always go back to the origin of comics, and the person I love, of course, is Robert Crumb. And Crumb, actually never cared for academic kind of ideas about comics and all that. And there is this beautiful, beautiful comic strip, which is very rare. It's called Drawing Cartoons is Fun. And anyone can be a cartoonist. So, the whole idea of comics, cartoons is of course slightly different. It is not high art. You don't need training in order to be a great comic artist. You can just do it. You can just doodle it, and suddenly it's there. It's popular culture. It's very much sold here and there. You don't put a price there. It's actually part of your collection. You want it, but it's not as if you want it on the wall. You don't want to mount it on the wall. You want to tuck it inside your school bags and go to the schools and, read comics. And then, you may be caught with it. And then you will be sort of banned from it. So this idea of comics as, suddenly this idea of comics as art is so big. I feel flabbergasted. People come to me and say that we are doing research on graphic novels. I don't care. That's the word graphic novel. Why should I use a word novel? A different kind of media in order to talk about a word, replace a word called comics, which is rooted in popular imagination. So I say, okay, it's comics, but we say it's a long form comics or it's a long comics and all that. But I'd still use the word comics. You can use the word graphic novel, no problem in it. And you can use graphic narratives, whatever. I don't care. But the whole idea of sequential graphic narratives, as they are called, this idea of art and comics is played to such a level now that, it has become like a sacred object. Something to be worshipped, something that, long theses can be written. And when you are writing theses on comics, you are actually trying to put in all the literary theories. So I have, quotations from everybody, like Blanchard, everybody. I mean, unlikely things are coming to play, and you are making a medium which is an absolute root in forms unbelievably tactile. And we are making it complicated to such an extent that probably we are losing something in between. Something is lost in the translation. So what I do whenever I speak about comics, I try to talk about both sides of the coin. Be aware of the roots of comics. Be aware of the print culture, the cheap economy of the print culture from where it actually originates. Be also aware of the great artistry that these people actually possessed in order to make them so nice. So somewhere you have to draw the balance, between that, between that absolute cheap stuff that is, sold anywhere, and also, that sacred object that is kept in a corner of a kind of a museum to be sold at a high price. Somewhere there needs to be a balance. Can we go to the next one? So, there is a beautiful essay. So, let me see what was the actual idea about comics in 1936. And this is a very, very important essay. It's actually by Clement Greenberg. And it's a 1936 essay called The Avant-Garde and the Quiche. I'm not reading the essay. But if you read the essay, you will see that comics is something that's not important. Look, these are all Greenberg is a practitioner of pop art. So they are actually doing pop art and they are dismissing comics. Amazing. Greenberg, so Rauschenberg, you know all these people, right? Andy Warhol, Rauschenberg, and all of them doing pop art. But Clement Greenberg was one of the most important theorists of pop art, and he's dismissing comics as just kitsch. But what they are doing themselves, since they are in the galleries, suddenly they have got this sacred value. So these are complex issues that we need to think about. It's not about picking any comic books and talking about it. You just pick up a Munnu, you just pick up a Corridor, you just pick up a Joe Sacco book, and suddenly you start to read. Look, comics is very different from every medium, and every medium has a language. You cannot just, read a film like a novel. It's impossible. You cannot read a comics like any kind of theoretical paper. And this session, will be about those borderlines that we need to question. So I will talk about museum space, comics, panels. But in between, I will try to talk about what comics means to me personally, because I am first and foremost a comics fan, and later a comic book, whatever, academic or whatever you want to call me. And unless you have that involvement, I don't think a popular medium like comics you can intervene in a popular medium like comics as it is. You can just contribute another essay, you will just get an ISSN, whatever, but ultimately you will be actually contributing nothing to the body of work that will be probably, useful for later generation. Next. So let us talk about the other thing. What as comics. Now, this is exciting. Think of Pablo Picasso. Did Picasso ever draw comics? No, that's the answer, right? Okay, wonderful. So, can we go to the next slide? So, this is, of course, Gertrude Stein and Picasso. Can we go to the next slide? So, Picasso was a huge fan of Katzenjammer Kids. So, there are letters where he used to request Stein, send me those, stuff from America. These are cheap stuff, and send me those stuff. I want to study them. Because Picasso understood there is something in it which attracts him. There is something in it that is not there in traditional painting processes that really attracted him to it. And so if you look at this, comic, so this is Little Jimmy, another comic strip, and this is the very, very popular Katzenjammer Kids. And this used to come out in hordes in America. And so Gertrude Stein would come and actually bring those stuff and give it to Picasso. Sometimes she would send it across to him. And let us see if these things had an effect on Pablo Picasso. So this is something which is not talked about, not published too much, but let us see whether Picasso ever did anything close to comics. Next. Okay. So this is 1903, and this is from the draft book of Picasso. So this is actually very interesting. This is about the encounter with Mac Jacobs. And if you look at it, Picasso is actually dividing the painting into panels. Can you see? This is sequential. Can you see that? It is being divided into panels. Can you see that? So this is all in the draft book of Picasso. And I actually bumped on it, and this is very interesting. So you have this very interesting Picasso museum in Spain. And, if you actually go through the notebooks, very difficult sometimes to get access, but if you go through and suddenly you bump on these stuff. Now this went for an auction and huge amount of money because people thought that it may be a kind of a draft of comics by the great Pablo Picasso. Amazing. Let us go to the next slide. Now, what happened is Picasso actually created something very exciting. And the result will completely take all of you in this hall by surprise. You haven't seen this, right? I don't think you have seen this. You haven't seen this because it is not there in any traditional anthology, which is like the complete works of Picasso doesn't contain this drawing. This is actually a work called The Dream and Lie of Franco. And if you look at it, how many panels are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No. Don't change. Don't change. Aage chole jaan. Ami barum korchi. Aro aage. Yeah. 1, 2, 3. So how many? 9. And they are of equal length and width. You know what are these panels called? They are called democratic panels because all of them are supposedly equal, right? Now, this is very interesting. So if you look at this paneling, the last 4, these are all done in etching and these are all aquatints. And this is done when? January 8, 1937. Please note the date. So let us go next. Next. Yes. These last 4 panels were added when? June 7th, 1937. Okay? So Picasso is actually working on these comic style sequential narratives during 1937. And these are all in his draft books. Never published. He never thought it is important to publish. So you can assume that these are things which are there in his mind, playing in his mind, right? We can assume that, right? Because it is in the draft book. And then, can you go to the next slide? This one is known. Voila, comes Guernica, the great Picasso painting. Look at the date, June 1937. So very few people know the Great Guernica, probably, in all probability, if you look at the dates, collate it, and if you look at the letters during the time, the lies and, the lies of Franco actually became Guernica. And it's very exciting. Can you go back? Can you go back? If you look at this, can you see this picture? Huh? Remember this. Can you see? This is Wailing Woman. Can you see that? Can you see the horse head? Can you see all this stuff? Go to Guernica. Can you see? A lot of the elements that are there in Franco are repeated in Guernica. I have actually omitted certain more pages because it would have been more academic and technical. So behind Guernica, there are draft. Word the logic and say that Guernica has a possibility of a comics inside. Both are true, right? So actually, if you read Guernica, so this is a one panel picture, right? This is one panel, a singular picture. But even within that singular picture, there is a possibility of a sequential narrative. So the idea that comics means you need to only have panels, you need to travel this way, that way, are all bullshit. All up this because, of course, this is going live. I know this will be for me to defend later, but I know I can defend it. It's very important to understand that the idea of what is comics is impossible to define. Nobody can define what exactly is comics. Is it just sequential graphic narrative? I don't think it is as simplistic as it seems. So, Guernica is a very important example. You know Salvador Dali, right? Dali actually created the entire dream sequence in Buñuel, Unchi and Andalou, right? You know, the entire idea of the dream sequence came from Winsor Mackay's Dream of Rarebit Rabbit. I had it with me. Since it would be too long, I didn't show it. And there is a wonderful quote by Dali. Can we go to the next line? Next slide. This is amazing. Dali writing to Amanda Lear. Can you read it? Comics will be the culture of the year 3794. Of course, he's very funny here. So you have 1827 years in advance, which is good. In fact, it leaves me the time I need to create a collage with this 80 comics I am taking with me. So he's an avid comics reader, just like Picasso, right? This will be the birth of comics art. And on this, we will hold a grand opening with my divine presence, of course, just like Dali, on March 4th, 3794. Nobody knows. The dates are all, of course, a joke. But Dali knows that comics has so much potential. It's so difficult to just dismiss them as, sequential small stuff here and there, popular art and all that. He knows that there is something in it that is also there in what we call traditional art. There is something of traditional art in comics. There is something of comics in traditional art. Very difficult to separate. They have definitions. You have referencing. But I personally always think the line of separation is so thin that I prefer to call every comics art a painting. And I always think every painting has the possibility of comics within it. And unless you look at it that way, unless you are deep into it like that, unless you are umbilically, wedded with that idea, I don't think you are doing justice either to painting or to comics. I think this is true. I mean, this is something I'm telling from my own experience as a reader, not as an academic. Let us go to the next part. So, the first exhibition, a big exhibition of comics happened in MoMA in 1991. So, this is present, very, very new, right? 1991 is not far off. The big exhibition. So comics was always to be available where? In railway stalls, like they were sold like chapbooks even, right? আমরা এখানে নিষিদ্ধ বস্তু অনেক সময় হতো না, ইটস লাইক দে ওয়ার ব্যান্ড, অফ কোর্স দ্য কমিক্স কোড ইন আমেরিকা মেড ইট মোর কমপ্লিকেটেড, রাইট? সো কমিক্স made it to MoMA in 1991 suddenly, and people began to wake up to that great idea of comics as art. But don't you think comics was always art? That's a question that you need to answer. Why should you need a Dali and a Picasso to show it? Why should I actually use the example of Dali and Picasso to make you understand, to make people understand that there is great art behind the way comics creator work? And that is my whole point. Can we go to the next part? So let me show you how complex comics have become. This is one of my favorite comic artists, David B. And he has created this comics called Epileptic. I became fascinated with comics by reading this. It is a personal story of his brother who is an epileptic child. And there are traces of epileptic references that occurs in David B's mind as well, because he thinks that he will inherit that from his brother. So that's the story. Look at the way, can you see this panel? Is this a panel? Normally panels are all squares, rectangular, that's it, right? Look at this. This is the nose of the brother. Can you see how, the face of the brother becomes the matrix within which the narrative can be told. So don't get this set idea that comics is all about squares, rectangles, it's all about panels. Yes, that may be the simplest form of comics, right? But that's not the possibility that it can explore. And it's not only about avant-garde comics. I can show you amazing Superman panels where paneling is so complex that it can give you goosebumps. Just go and see Frank Whiteley's work on Superman, and you will understand how complex those panels are. Can we go to the next one? Let me show you another panel. Look at this. This is Charles Burns, one of the most important comic artists of our time. Let us try to read this. This is tougher than your average philosopher sometimes. What is this? This is the face, right? Right? How many panels are there? Can you tell me? You cannot even count because a lot of panels are overlapping with each other. Can you see? So panels are not actually fixed. Some panels, so you can see that there are 2 layers of panels, right? And even within these 2 layers, if you look at it, there is of course a ironical binary. Can you see a black man, and can you see the white woman, and can you see the snake, and can you see the black snake and the white snake, and can you see the whole skull-like thing coming up? So if you look close, it looks slightly different. If you look far away, suddenly the whole perspective change. So don't think, since we are only acquainted with Matul and Tintin and Asterix, that's the only limit to which comics can go. Comics can stretch, I think it's intergalactic. And there are examples. There is a comic by Mark Antoine Matthew. It's called 3 Seconds. You know what the comics is all about? 64 pages of a bullet missing a mark, going and getting reflected everywhere. 64 pages of this 3 seconds done in a comics form. He has created palindrome comics, So if you read the comics 48 pages this way, it is the same comics, and if you read it the other way, the same comics. Can you imagine how complex comics can be? So what I'm trying to say, that what you think as frivolous, popular, the world idea of popular is a misnomer. Okay? I don't like this labeling at all. Anything, of course, popular is, of course, because it is accepted, by a lot of more people probably. But I don't care about those words, adages. It's important to ask those questions. Are we So what is the question that you need to ask? Can we just go? Next panel. Niche ache. Yeah. I love this. What is comics? So A.D. Campbell was asked, what is comics? And what he answered, I love this. Comics is not a form, it signifies a movement. Consequently, there is nothing to be gained by defining it. And then he suddenly gives something which we normally don't associate comics for. Sound is something that is visual in comics, it's extra diegetic, right? But he says, go to the source, go to the creator, listen carefully. Can you hear them? The scratching of the pens and the pencils, the clatter of their keyboards. At this moment, all the world, people are preparing more comics, more stories, and defining a moment. And then he adds something very interesting. Are you sitting comfortably? Even the most popular comics may not allow you to be, super comfortable. Comics sometimes, because it is slow art. You know what is slow art? Cinema, of course, it passes, you need that rewind button. Comics, the very turn of the page is an act, which is, of course, under your control. You are turning the page, you can turn back, you can go to any page. So it's slow cinema unspooling in your mind at your own control. No medium gives you that kind of control. Visual, of course, visual medium. Of course, any reading does it, but visual, and with this correlation between visual and words and everything comes together in comics, so it's slightly different than comics. And I personally feel we haven't given it a thought at all, as much as we should have done. So next, can we go to the next one? So let us talk about space and comics, because ultimately I'll talk about Louvre, and I'll talk about this museum and this idea of space. So my example for it is a comic that very few people know, and I'm 100% sure nobody has seen it here. Can we go? This is actually done in a time when there was no adage called graphic novel. It was called a comics, and it's done by Martin Von James, and it's called Cage. Now think, what is a cage? The book is a cage. Within the book, if there are square panels which you are acquainted with, is another cage. And within that cage, there are more cages, right? So if you actually look at panels, the book itself is like, almost like a metaphor of a cage. What Von Smith does is amazing. Von James does is amazing. Next slide. So he creates this book of very interesting visuals. So the first one is a cage. And can you see the page floating in? And there is this cage. But very interestingly, the cage is demarcated in the middle. Now, comics introduces something which is normally not there in painting. It's not there in obvious way in painting, and it's the idea of time. And I'll tell you why. So this may be pictured in 10:10 a.m. This may be pictured in 10:1 a.m. You never know. I mean, I'm telling you. So this idea of movement, idea of sequentiality is also the introduction of time. So if it was together, the idea of time would have been difficult because it is all in the same time stamp. But the moment you are dividing it, the time is, can be calibrated both backwards and forward. Next. So, and as you enter the cage, you actually enter a room. And in the room, he actually created this wonderful world. Can you see? Can you see these recording things? Can you see these mics? So they are like speech, but not direct speech. Speech which is recorded, right? What is it? Normally we use speech balloons and all that. So he uses the metaphor of complex recording instrument and also the mics. These are old recorders. And can you see? There is a bed. And the bed is almost floating, and you can see that there is threads, right? Blankets threaded. So it's almost metaphorically representing the idea of a narrative through the bed, the plot, the threads, the threaded bed sheets. And you have seen the recording devices, And can you see the viewing devices? All these things. Can we go next? And next page, suddenly, instead of the recording things, we have what? Pictures. So, of course, you need to create balloons, words, and you need words. What? Pictures. And together, of course, the word pictures come together metaphorically, and you view the blanket, the narrative, in order to create comics. Can we go to the next one? It's a very complex book. I'm not explaining it. But what is very interesting is the next room. Can you see? The blanket is all. Can you see the blanket bed is almost forcing its way? Can you see through the door? And you can see every picture is kept down, and you have almost ink on the floor. It's a 180-page book, and the book is actually the metaphor of how comics is created. It's all done through these vestiges of dilapidated buildings, inks, recording instruments, all the raw materials that are needed in order to make comics possible. It is so exciting to know that this is done in 1975, when sophisticated theorists haven't yet applied their great theories on comics. But this person has, probably showed it in his own book. Let us go to the next one. There will be a time, and I'm taking a big leap, when you need to break the cage. And that is when he adds, it is the reader who will break the cage. The creator may create the cage. Within the cage there are elements. But unless the reader knows what is happening inside, knows the way art is, knows the processes, they cannot break the cage. And that is what he shows here. So I find this idea of comics as an artist medium, which is created, and then the reader reading it or trying to read it through artist's eyes, as a very important possibility of reading comics. And we don't do it. Normally we don't do it. Let us look at next. What is museum? And this is very old logic. And since this is mainly for students, can we just go to the next slide? If you look at the museum space, can you go to the next one? We have this very interesting ready-made. This is Marcel Duchamp. Have you heard of Marcel Duchamp? A lot of you may have or may not have. So Marcel Duchamp picked up, this urinal from the garbage heap and entered it into competition by paying money. And he signed R. Mutt 1917. It was not accepted. It was accepted because you have to accept it, but it was not exhibited because people thought, why should we exhibit it? It is a normal thing. But whenever you are putting that daily object into a space called the museum, it is becoming art. Right? So what is Duchamp trying to point out? Is that idea of space that museum creates, that sacred space that museum creates, sometimes makes you forget the real processes through which the artist walks. Because the museums are all about what? Creating not only masterpieces, viewing it, not appreciating it. The value is basically commercially evaluated. Museum is also a very important commercial space. So we forget the processes that the artists undertake. So when I talk about going back to the roots, I'm not talking about the fast comics that was created. I'm talking about the first scratch of pen on the paper that any comic artists make. And that is where your reading starts. Now you cannot read him or her. You understand what goes on in order to make your reading enriching. Can we go to the next one? Okay, next one. This is called fountain. And that, urinal, when it is placed in a museum space, look, This is high art. So amazing that, when we create, so today I'm speaking here, right? I'm speaking in an enclosed space with an audience who knows what I'm speaking about. If I speak it outside the street, people will call me mad. It's also the space which we occupy that makes a huge difference. So sometimes when you actually read comics, you read stuff, when you create things, right? You may not be aware of the context, the source within which you are creating it. So when you are applying your theories, when you are applying your stuff, sometimes we get lost in the melee of, theories. I'm not against theory, I'm all for it. But be very careful in what you are trying to do. Next. So let us talk about museum comics and what I call the thickness of space. It's a very complex concept. So what is panels? Panels is what? This is one panel, this is another panel, right? So normally we move, right? But have you ever given it a thought that the panels are also thick? The panels are also thick. And how do you talk about thickness? It's ultimately a prospect for any kind of study. And I find it view. And Napoleon III. If you want duration,